The first laugh came from the man holding the survey flag. He stood at the edge of the burned marsh, his boots sinking into the black mud, and pointed at 76-year-old Mabel Hargrove as if she were part of the wreckage itself. "You turned down $80,000 for this?" he said. Behind him, the county supervisor smiled. The developer's men lowered their clipboards. Even Mabel's own son looked away, ashamed and tired, because every person standing there believed the same thing. The marsh was dead. It smelled of ash and standing water. The reeds were gray and lifeless. The old ditch lines had collapsed under years of mud. Nothing grew there except mosquitoes, cattails, and memories nobody wanted to keep. Mabel stood in front of them with both hands wrapped around an old measuring stick her husband had carved 40 years earlier. The wood was dark from rain and hand oil. Small notches had been cut along one side, and the initials R.H. were burned near the handle. She did not shout. She did not defend herself. She did not even lower her eyes. She only looked toward the dark line of trees beyond the marsh and said, "You'll need this place before summer's over." They laughed harder then. They laughed at the burned marsh. They laughed at the old widow. They laughed at the measuring stick in her hands, as if all of it belonged to a past no one needed anymore. But 3 weeks later, when the wildfire crossed Miller Ridge and the town hydrants coughed dry, nobody was laughing at the widow's swamp anymore. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and places the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next was not just about a widow, a burned marsh, or a piece of land nobody wanted. It was about the truth waiting under the mud. The offer came in a blue-sealed county envelope. Mabel Hargrove read it 3 times before Daniel arrived. $80,000. Cash. No repairs, no boundary fight, no delay. To anyone else, it would have sounded like mercy. Her roof leaked. The porch had sunk. The furnace coughed all winter. Medical bills sat in a coffee tin above the stove. And Daniel knew them by heart, because he had started paying what he could without telling her. So when Mabel said no, Daniel did not yell at first. He sat across from her, rubbed his face, and whispered, "Mama, please don't do this." But by noon, the developer came in person. Grant Voss arrived in polished boots, not made for mud. He brought 2 survey men, a junior attorney, and 3 trucks marked Voss Regional Storage. They parked where the cattails thinned and the ground turned soft. County Supervisor Elaine Porter followed in a gray sedan. She stepped out carefully, keeping her shoes from the black water and the ruts. Elaine had known Mabel for 30 years, but that afternoon, she used the distant voice people save for confused old women. "Mabel," she said, "this is no longer about sentiment." Mabel stood by the fence line in her faded coat, Roy's measuring stick upright in one hand. Grant looked past her at the marsh. A thin wind moved through the burned reeds. Some broke instead of bending. The fire from 2 summers earlier had scarred the low ground, and where ash mixed with mud, the marsh looked bruised. "This land is a hazard," Elaine said. "The county report is clear. Standing fuel, dead vegetation, no productive use, no maintained drainage." Grant gave a small laugh. "Productive use," he said. "That's a polite way to say it." One surveyman smiled. Daniel saw it and looked down. Mabel saw him look down, and that hurt worse than the laugh. Grant unfolded a paper and held it toward her. She did not take it. "Mrs. Hargrove, my company is offering $80,000 for ground no bank here would lend against. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to be honest. That swamp has no agricultural value, no residential value, and after the last fire, barely any insurable value." "It isn't a swamp," Mabel said. Grant glanced at Elaine. "What would you call it?" Mabel looked at the gray cattails, bent fence posts, and shallow channels hidden under dead grass. "A place that remembers water," she said. The surveyman with the flag laughed first. Another man coughed into his glove. Grant only smiled, as if pity gave him permission to stand on her land and judge her mind. Daniel stepped closer. "Just listen to them," he said quietly. "Please, we can fix the roof. We can pay the pharmacy. You won't have to keep choosing which bill waits." Mabel tightened her hand around Roy's stick. She loved her son. That was the cruelest part. Daniel was not greedy. He was tired. Tired of borrowed patches, rain buckets, and neighbors calling Roy Hargrove a fool who spent his life waist-deep in mud for nothing. Elaine opened a folder. "If you refuse the private offer," she said, "the county may still proceed under public safety authority. There will be a hearing. The land can be condemned as a fire risk." Mabel looked at her. "How soon?" Elaine hesitated. 14 days. Daniel turned sharply. 14? Grant slid the paper back into his folder. That's why we're trying to give you a cleaner way out. Mabel stared past him. Beyond the marsh, Miller Ridge rose in a dark line of pine, scrub oak, and dry brush. In late summer, the ridge looked thirsty. Roy used to stand here and watch it like other men watched the sky. Grant followed her gaze. What do you think this place is worth? He asked. Honestly. Mabel lowered the measuring stick into the mud. It sank 6 inches, then stopped against something firm under the black water. Not what it is, she said. What it holds back. No one answered. Then Grant sighed. Elaine closed the folder. Daniel looked at his mother as if he no longer knew how to reach her. The survey crew began planting orange flags along the marsh, one after another, bright warnings against the dead gray reeds. When they finally left, tire tracks filled with dark water. Mabel stayed until the last truck disappeared. Then she stepped into the marsh, placed Roy's stick beside the first old channel, and watched the water climb to a notch almost hidden beneath dirt. Beside that notch, carved in letters worn soft by 40 years of weather, were 3 words. R.H. Northgate. Mabel closed her eyes, and for the first time that day, she looked afraid. Roy Hargrove had never been a man who tried to make people look at him. He was quiet in rooms, quieter in crowds, and almost invisible at county meetings unless someone needed a culvert cleared or a gate chain pulled from mud. He wore the same brown work coat for years, with one pocket sagging from a folded map, a grease pencil, and a small brass valve key. But around Miller's Crossing, Roy knew water better than any man alive. He knew which ditch filled first after hard rain. He knew which pond turned sour in August. He knew where the mud stayed cold even when the air was hot enough to wrinkle paint. He used to tell Daniel, when the boy was small enough to follow him in rubber boots, water goes where the ground remembers. Mabel used to smile at that. Back then, she did not hate the marsh. She only wished it did not need so much of him. There was always a fence leaning, a porch board softening, a bill waiting under the sugar jar. Yet Roy still walked the low ground before breakfast, and again near dusk, especially when the wind came down from Miller Ridge dry and sharp. He worked part-time for the county as a ditch rider. The title sounded better than the pay. Most folks thought he trimmed brush and checked drainage after storms. Roy knew the work was older than that. The marsh was not wild ground. It was a stitched-together system of farmer ditches, mill channels, wooden gates, and pressure ponds built by people whose names had fallen off the maps. Then came the South Ridge fire. Miller's Crossing did not speak plainly about that night afterward. People said the wind shifted. They said the crews did the best they could. They said old houses burned faster than anyone expected. Roy came home near dawn with soot on his neck, and blood dried across his knuckles. Mabel was waiting in the kitchen, Daniel asleep on 2 chairs beside the stove. Roy stood in the doorway as if he had forgotten how to enter his own house. "Roy?" she whispered. He looked at his hands. Then he walked to the table, pulled a wet map from his coat, and spread it beneath the lamp. Mabel reached for him. He stepped back. It was the first time he had ever flinched from her touch. After that night, Roy changed in ways the town missed, and Mabel could not. He stopped sleeping through thunder. He left his boots beside the back door instead of in the shed. Every Sunday evening, he sharpened his shovel and cleaned the brass valve key until it shone. That winter, he carved the measuring stick. It began as a straight piece of cedar from behind the barn. He sanded it at the kitchen table while Daniel did homework. Then came the notches, small and deliberate, 1 low, 3 close together, a long burned line near the handle. "What are those marks for?" Mabel asked. Roy kept his eyes on the wood. "For remembering," he said. She wanted to ask more, but grief had put a locked door inside him. Years passed. The county built a modern pump station. New maps replaced the old linen ones. Younger men in clean shirts talked about efficiency and liability. Roy kept walking the marsh anyway. Daniel grew old enough to resent it. At 16, he saw what the marsh cost their family. He saw his mother stretch leftovers into supper. He heard boys at school call his father the swamp keeper. He watched Roy spend unpaid evenings clearing gates nobody else believed existed. One night, Daniel found him washing mud from the valve key. "Why do you care more about that place than us?" he asked. Mabel froze by the stove. Roy set the key down slowly. For a moment, it looked as if he might finally explain. His eyes moved toward the folded map on the pantry shelf. Then he said, "I care about it because of you." Daniel left before the sentence could become anything else. He carried that wound into adulthood. He left Miller's Crossing as soon as he could, came back only when Mabel called, and learned to hate the marsh because it had taken his father's time, health, and tenderness without ever giving the family anything back. Roy kept aging in the mud. His cough deepened, his shoulders narrowed. The doctor blamed smoke damage and years of damp work. Roy did not argue. He only watched Miller Ridge from the bedroom window during his last dry summer, with the measuring stick and folded map on the table beside him. One evening, when the sky had turned copper, he asked Mabel to bring the stick closer. She laid it across his lap. His fingers moved over the notches like a man reading a prayer. "Mabel," he said, "I'm here. If fire ever comes from Miller Ridge," his breath caught, "don't let them drain the marsh." Mabel bent closer. "Why, Roy?" His eyes filled with a sorrow she had never been able to name. "Because I waited once," he whispered. "And waiting cost people their homes." 3 days later, Roy Hargrove died before sunrise. After the funeral, people called him a good man, a quiet man, maybe a strange one, but good. Daniel stood beside Mabel in a dark suit, saying almost nothing. When the visitors left, she found him in the shed holding the measuring stick. For one soft second, she thought he understood. Then he looked at the cedar marks and said, "That place took everything from him." Mabel had no answer, because part of her feared he was right. For 7 years, she kept Roy's promise anyway. She measured water no one asked about. She cleared brush from channels no county map showed. She stood in black mud, with his last words in her ears, and tried to believe that love was reason enough. But after Grant Voss planted orange flags along the marsh, love no longer felt like enough. That evening, Mabel took the old coffee tin down from above the stove and moved the medical bills aside. Behind them lay Roy's folded map, soft at the creases, marked in his careful hand. The north side showed gate numbers, ditch lines, and water depths. The bottom corner had been cut away, cleanly, deliberately. Near the missing piece, 2 faded words remained. South Pond. Mabel touched them with one trembling finger. And for the first time since Roy died, she wondered if his promise had not been the whole truth, but only the part he could bear to leave behind. The missing corner would force her back into the marsh, not to remember Roy, but to find out what he had hidden there. The next morning, Mabel went back to the marsh before the town had fully woken. She did not bring coffee. She did not bring breakfast. She brought Roy's measuring stick, the torn map folded inside a bread sack, and a pair of gloves so old the fingertips had gone shiny from work. The sky was pale over Miller Ridge, the kind of pale that made the trees look farther away than they were. A thin ground fog hung low over the burned reeds, and for a while, the marsh seemed almost peaceful. Almost. To anyone driving past on County Road 6, it looked like ruined land. Gray cattails, black mud, charred grass, standing water filled with ash and pollen, a fence line half swallowed by willow roots. Orange survey flags snapping in the morning wind like little warnings that the place had already been claimed by people who did not understand it. But Mabel did not look at the marsh the way Grant Voss had looked at it. She looked where Roy would have looked, at the lean of the cattails, at the low places where frost lingered longer, at the way a patch of muddy water trembled, even though there was no wind against it. She stepped off the dry edge and placed one boot carefully into the black mud. It took her weight slowly, then held. She moved the way Roy had taught her after his knees first began to hurt, never straight across, never trusting the surface, always testing before shifting. The measuring stick sank beside her boot. 6 inches, then 9. Then it stopped against something firm. Mabel bent, wiped mud from the cedar with her thumb, and found the old mark again. R. H. Northgate. She unfolded the map with both hands, careful not to tear the softened creases. The north side of the marsh was crowded with Roy's writing. Gate marks, depth numbers, arrows showing flow direction. But below the lowest channel, the map simply ended where the paper had been cut away. South Pond should have been there. Instead, there was absence. Mabel looked across the marsh. For years, she had thought of this place as Roy's burden, something he loved because he knew its moods, something he had left her because grief made men ask impossible things from the living. But now she saw the marsh differently. The cattails were not random. They grew in lines too clean for chance. One row curved behind a stand of black willow, then vanished under a mat of dead grass. Another ran toward the old mill road before bending sharply south, where the map was missing. Channels. Buried, choked, forgotten, but still there. Mabel pushed through the reeds until she reached a patch of mud that stayed darker than the ground around it. She knelt with a small sound of pain and brushed away wet leaves. Beneath them, her fingers touched wood. Not driftwood, cut wood, a flat edge, swollen with age. Her breath caught. She cleared more mud and found the top of an old wooden gate, almost completely buried. The iron ring fixed into it was rusted dark, but when Mabel hooked 2 fingers through and pulled, it shifted just enough to send a thin line of bubbles up through the water. She sat back on her heels. The gate was not dead. It was stuck. That was different. "Mama," Daniel's voice cracked across the marsh, hard enough to startle a crow from the willow. Mabel turned and saw him standing at the edge of the road in his work jacket, one hand raised against the glare. For a second, he looked like he had when he was 15, angry before he knew whether he was scared. "What are you doing out there?" he shouted. "Looking. For what?" Mabel glanced down at the gate. Proof. Daniel stepped into the mud, cursed when his boots sank too deep, and fought his way toward her. By the time he reached her, his jeans were wet to the knee, and his face was flushed. "You could fall out here," he said. "Nobody would see you from the road. I've walked this ground 7 years. You're 76. I know how old I am. Do you?" His voice sharpened, then broke softer. "Because yesterday, they gave you a way out, and this morning I find you kneeling in a swamp like you're trying to disappear into it." Mabel stood slowly, using the stick. Daniel saw the strain in her shoulders and reached to help, but she moved before he could touch her. That wounded him more than she meant it to. She pointed with the stick toward the buried wood. "That's North Gate." Daniel stared at the muddy patch. "That's a rotten board." "No, it's a gate." "To what?" Mabel opened the map and held it out. Daniel took it reluctantly. At first his eyes moved over Roy's handwriting with the same old frustration. Then he saw the cut corner. His thumb paused at the missing edge. "Did Dad do this?" "I don't know." "Then who did?" "I don't know that either." Daniel looked toward the survey flags along the road. "This is what I mean, Mama. Every answer leads to another hole, another mark, another piece of Dad nobody can explain. And while you're chasing it, the county is getting ready to take the land anyway." Mabel folded the map. "The land is not what they think." "Maybe not," Daniel said, "but it's still costing you." He did not say the roof. He did not say the bills. He did not need to. Those things stood between them like people in the room. Mabel looked back at the buried gate. A faint trickle of water had begun to seep from beneath its lower edge, clearer than the black water around it. Not much, barely enough to move a thread of ash. But it moved. Daniel saw it too. For one moment, he stopped arguing. Then the wind shifted, and both of them smelled smoke. Not fire close enough to see, not yet. Just the dry, bitter smell that sometimes drifted down from Miller Ridge when brush crews burned slash piles or when someone ignored a no-burn warning. Mabel looked toward the ridge. Daniel followed her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "Don't start making that into a sign." Mabel did not answer. They walked back to the house in silence, carrying mud on their boots and different kinds of fear in their chests. On the porch, Daniel pulled the county envelope from his truck and held it out. "This came yesterday," he said. "I didn't want to show you until I read it twice." Mabel took the paper. The condemnation hearing had been moved. Not 14 days. 6. Daniel watched her read it. "They're not waiting," he said. Mabel looked past him, toward the marsh where North Gate lay buried under black mud, and a thin line of clear water had begun to run. If the county was moving faster, then she would have to move faster too. And the only place left to look was inside the records they had already told her did not exist. The county records office smelled like dust, floor wax, and old paper that had given up being useful. Mabel had not been inside that building since Roy died. The front hallway still had the same faded photographs of former supervisors, the same glass case full of county fair ribbons, the same map of Miller's Crossing mounted on the wall beside the clerk's window. But the map was wrong. Mabel saw it before anyone spoke to her. The town was there. The highway was there. Miller Ridge was shaded dark green. County Road 6 curved past her property just as it should. But the marsh was a blank patch of pale beige. No North Gate, no Willow Cut, no South Pond, no channels at all. Just empty county land, marked with a parcel number. Mabel stood in front of it longer than she meant to. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked. She was a young woman with red glasses and a voice that sounded trained to stay polite through anything. "I need the old water maps for the East Marsh," Mabel said. "Before the pump station, before they redrew the drainage." The clerk typed for a while. Then she typed some more. "We have floodplain assessments," she said. "I don't need those." "Environmental hazard reports." "No." "Fire fuel surveys." Mabel looked at the blank place on the wall map. "I need the gate maps." The clerk stopped typing. "Gate maps? Wooden water gates, ditch lines, pressure pond records. Roy Hargrove maintained them for the county." At the sound of Roy's name, the clerk's expression changed just enough for Mabel to see that she had found something on the screen. Then, the door behind the counter opened. Elaine Porter stepped out with a folder pressed to her chest. "Mabel," she said, "I thought that might be you." The clerk looked relieved. Mabel did not. Elaine guided her into a small side office with 2 chairs, a metal desk, and blinds that cut the morning light into narrow strips. On the wall behind her hung a newer county map, cleaner than the one in the hallway. On that version, the marsh looked even emptier. "Mabel," Elaine began, "if this is about the hearing, it's about the maps." Elaine's face stayed calm. "The county has already provided all current public records related to the parcel. I'm not asking for current. I'm asking for true." A faint crease appeared between Elaine's eyebrows. "That land has no active water infrastructure. Then why did my husband mark North Gate on his measuring stick?" Elaine was silent for half a second too long. It was not much, but Mabel had been married to a quiet man for 49 years. She knew how to hear a silence. Elaine opened the folder. Roy did a great deal of informal work over the years. Not all of it was officially documented. Some of those old features, if they existed, are obsolete now. The county cannot rely on private notes, old sketches, or a widow's memory when public safety is involved. "A widow's memory," Mabel repeated. Elaine softened her voice. "I didn't mean it that way." "Yes," Mabel said. "You did." Before Elaine could answer, there was a knock on the open door. Grant Voss stood in the hallway, hat in hand, wearing the pleasant expression of a man who had never entered a room without knowing exactly what he wanted from it. "Supervisor Porter," he said. "Mrs. Hargrove, I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Mabel said. Grant smiled as if she had made a joke. "I'll be brief. My people reviewed the condemnation schedule. Given the shortened timeline, I'm authorized to raise the offer to $95,000, provided we can resolve this before the hearing." Elaine looked uncomfortable. "That discussion should happen through council." "It's a generous offer," Grant said, "especially considering the drainage issues near Willowcut." Mabel went still. Elaine's eyes moved to him sharply. Grant seemed to realize, a breath too late, what he had said. Mabel's voice was quiet. "How do you know that name?" Grant blinked once. "I'm sorry?" "Willowcut." He recovered quickly. "Old local term, I suppose. One of my surveyors must have mentioned it. It isn't on your public maps." Grant gave another small smile. "Mrs. Hargrove, not every old nickname means something." Mabel stood. "No," she said, "but some do." She left without taking the offer. By noon, half the diner had heard about it. That was how Miller's Crossing worked. News did not travel. It seeped. By the time Mabel walked past the front window, 2 men at the counter were already laughing about how she had gone to the county office looking for ghost ditches. One of them lifted his coffee cup and said, "Careful, boys. Old Mabel might find a river under the parking lot." The other man said, "If she does, maybe Voss can buy that too." Mabel kept walking. Daniel did not. He had been standing near the register with a parts receipt in his hand. His jaw tightened as the laughter rose behind him. For years, he had hated the marsh for what it did to his father, but hearing strangers make his mother small in public lit a different anger in him. "Enough," he said. The diner quieted. The man with the coffee cup shrugged. "Didn't mean nothing by it." Daniel looked at him. That's usually what people say after they mean something. Outside, he found Mabel beside his truck. "You can't keep doing this," he said. "I didn't ask you to defend me. No, you'd rather stand there and let them turn you into some story they laugh about over lunch." Mabel looked tired then. More tired than she had looked in the marsh. "I've been laughed at before. That doesn't make it right." "No," she said. "It only makes it familiar." That evening, Mabel went back to North Gate alone. She waited until the road emptied and the light turned gold behind Miller Ridge. She carried a shovel, Roy's brass valve key, and the measuring stick. The mud was colder than the air. Mosquitoes gathered at her sleeves. Somewhere in the reeds, water ticked softly against wood. She dug around the iron ring until her hands cramped. The gate shifted, but would not open. She tried the valve key in a rusted fitting hidden under the mud. The metal screamed once, then froze. She leaned her weight into it, teeth clenched, breath sharp in her chest. "Nothing. Come on," she whispered. "Come on, Roy." The fitting slipped. Mabel lost her balance and went down hard on one knee. Black water splashed up her coat. For a terrible second, the mud held her boot and would not let go. Then Daniel's hands were under her arms. He dragged her backward onto firmer ground, breathing hard. "Are you trying to die out here?" he shouted. Mabel sat in the wet grass, shaking from effort and cold. Daniel knelt in front of her. "Look at me," he said. "Please, look at me." She did. His anger was gone. Only fear remained. "This place already took Dad," he said. "I won't let it take you too." Mabel wanted to tell him everything, but she still did not know what everything was. Daniel helped her stand. When he bent to pick up the measuring stick, his thumb rubbed mud from a small line of carving near the handle. He frowned and turned it toward the fading light. There, half hidden beneath years of hand oil and dirt, were 4 words neither of them had noticed before. "Ask Lottie." "South Pond." Mabel looked toward the darkening marsh. Daniel followed her eyes. For once, he did not tell her to stop. The records had failed her. The gate had failed her. The county had lied with blank maps and polite voices. So the next answer would not come from paper. It would have to come from someone old enough to remember what the paper had erased. Lottie Mae lived in a narrow white house behind the old laundromat, where the street dipped low enough to flood after every hard rain. Mabel had not seen her in nearly a year, not because of any quarrel. In a small town, distance did not always come from anger. Sometimes it came from age, tired bones, and the quiet shame of not wanting another person to see how little you had left. Daniel drove. He did not ask many questions on the way. The measuring stick lay across Mabel's knees, the 4 words near the handle cleaned with a damp towel until they could no longer pretend they had not been there. "Ask Lottie. South Pond." When Lottie opened the door, she looked first at Mabel, then at Daniel, then at the stick. Her face changed. Not much, just enough. "No," Lottie said. Mabel had not spoken yet. "Lottie," she said softly. "I said no." The old woman started to close the door, but Mabel placed one hand against the frame. "Roy left your name." Lottie's eyes moved back to the cedar stick. For a moment, the street behind them seemed to go still. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses down. Water dripped from a rusted gutter, though it had not rained since morning. Lottie stepped aside. Inside, her house smelled of lemon cleaner, old curtains, and coffee left warming too long. Family photographs crowded the mantel. Children, grandchildren, a young man in uniform, a girl in a white Sunday dress, standing beside a house Mabel did not recognize. Lottie saw her looking. "That was South Row," she said. Daniel shifted near the doorway. "I've never heard of South Row." "No," Lottie said. "That was the point." She lowered herself into a chair by the window and folded both hands around the head of her cane. Mabel sat across from her. Daniel remained standing. For a while, Lottie said nothing. Her eyes stayed on Roy's measuring stick, as if it were not wood but a witness. Finally, she said, "We weren't much to look at. 12 houses, maybe 14 if you count the 2 shacks past the Cottonwood Bend, mostly mill families, some farmhands. People who rented land nobody else wanted and made it home anyway." "Near the marsh?" Mabel asked. "South edge," Lottie said, "past the willow cut. There was a pond there, not pretty, not like the lake rich folks put on postcards, but it held water when everything else ran low." "South Pond," Mabel whispered. Lottie nodded. "Roy knew it. My daddy knew it. Everybody down there knew it. That pond fed a ditch line behind our houses. In dry summers, it kept gardens alive. In fire season, it was the only reason our side of town slept at all." Daniel's face tightened. "If it was real, why isn't it on the maps?" Lottie looked at him with a tired patience that made him glance away. "Because maps are made by people who get to decide what counts." The room seemed smaller after that. Mabel touched the stick. "Roy told me if fire ever came from Miller Ridge, not to let them drain the marsh." Lottie's mouth trembled once before she pressed it flat. "He should have told you more." The words did not sound cruel. They sounded heavy. Mabel felt them settle inside her. "What happened that night?" she asked. Lottie looked toward the photograph of the girl in the white dress. "I was 17. Wind was wrong. Everybody knew it. Smoke came over the ridge before dark, and by supper the men were out with shovels, wet sacks, anything they could carry. We waited for water from the North Channel. And it came slow," Lottie said. "Too slow. Daniel stopped leaning against the wall. Why? Lottie did not answer him directly. She pointed at the measuring stick. Roy came after, near dawn, covered in soot, half out of his mind. He opened something by hand. I remember him in the ditch, yelling for somebody to pull the gate chain. But by then our houses were gone. Mabel heard Roy's last words again. Because I waited once. And South Row? She asked. Lottie gave a small, bitter smile. After the fire, they said most of us were renters, temporary, unofficial. Some families left for cousins in other counties. Some went north. Some never got enough money to start over. A few names made the paper. Most didn't. That can't be all, Daniel said. Lottie turned to him. It was enough to erase us. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, Lottie pushed herself up with her cane. If Roy marked my name, he wanted you to find what's still there. At South Pond? If the willows haven't eaten it. Daniel looked at Mabel. For once, he did not argue. They drove out together in Daniel's truck, Lottie in the passenger seat. Mabel pressed between her and Daniel, like the years had folded them all into the same narrow road. Lottie directed them past the usual Marsh entrance, then farther south along a rutted service track Mabel had not used since Roy's funeral. Stop here, Lottie said. There was nothing to see at first. Only willow roots, dead reeds, and mud dark enough to swallow light. But Lottie pointed with her cane toward a low mound near the trees. Vent pipe used to be there. Daniel stepped down first. He helped Lottie, then Mabel. The three of them moved slowly through the reeds until Mabel saw it, a circle of rust hidden beneath roots, no wider than a coffee can. Daniel crouched and pulled vines away. The pipe was capped with a piece of rotted wood. Mabel lowered Roy's stick beside it. The mud took the cedar almost to the second notch. Then the ground burped. A small bubble rose. Then another. Daniel looked up. Mabel gripped the stick with both hands. Lottie closed her eyes. A thin thread of water slipped from beneath the roots, not brown and dead like the standing pools around them, but clear, cold, moving. Daniel touched it with 2 fingers as if he did not trust his eyes. That's pressure, he said quietly. Mabel nodded. Not triumphantly. Not yet. The water was too small to save anything, too hidden to prove enough. But it was real. For the first time, Daniel looked at the marsh without anger. He looked afraid. Then an engine coughed on the north side. All 3 turned. Beyond the cattails, one of Grant Voss's brush machines was crawling along the marsh edge, cutting a path through dead reeds near the survey flags. Its metal teeth chewed through willow roots and old grass, throwing black mud behind it. Daniel stood. They're not supposed to start before the hearing. The machine lurched forward. Somewhere under the marsh, something cracked. The clear thread of water near the vent pipe pulsed once, then began running faster, but in the wrong direction. Lottie's face went pale. Mabel looked from the broken flow to the distant machine. The marsh had finally spoken loudly enough for Daniel to hear, but now someone else was cutting into its throat. The crack under the marsh did not sound loud from the road. It was not the kind of sound that made men turn off engines or look up from clipboards. To Grant Voss's brush crew, it was probably nothing more than a root snapping under the teeth of the machine. But Lottie heard it and gripped her cane with both hands. Mabel heard it and went still. Daniel heard it too. The thin, clear water at the vent pipe pulsed again, then slipped sideways through the mud, no longer seeping toward the low channel Roy had marked on the map. It was bleeding into a shallow rut cut by the machine tracks. That's wrong, Mabel said. Daniel looked from the water to the north edge of the marsh. They hit something. No, Lottie whispered. They opened something halfway. Mabel started moving before either of them could stop her. She followed the water by sight, then by sound, then by the feel of the ground under her boots. Daniel stayed close this time. He did not tell her to turn back. He held the reeds aside for Lottie and kept one hand ready behind his mother's elbow, not touching her unless she needed it. The water led them deeper south, past the vent pipe, past a stand of black willow, past a fallen fence post Mabel had never noticed because it lay under moss and mud, pointing toward the missing corner of Roy's map like an old finger. Then the marsh opened into a hollow. It was not large, maybe 30 yards across. Most of it was hidden under willow roots and dead reeds, but the ground dipped in a way that did not feel natural. The cattails grew in a rough circle around it, and in the center, under a skin of black water, Mabel saw something move. Not wind. Current. South Pond, Lottie said. The words came out like a name spoken at a grave. Daniel stepped forward. then stopped when the mud softened under him. This is what they erased? Lottie's eyes stayed on the water. One of the things. Mabel unfolded Roy's map. The cut edge trembled in her hand. The missing piece would have shown this place. She knew it now. The channels on the north side were not separate lines. They all bent toward this hollow, toward this hidden pond under the willows. Roy had not been maintaining random ditches. He had been keeping a heart beating. Near the eastern edge, Daniel found the gate by accident. His boot struck iron beneath the water, and he nearly fell before catching himself on a willow trunk. There's something here. Mabel came to him, lowering the measuring stick first. It struck wood at the second notch. She knelt carefully and brushed mud away with both gloved hands until the top of a smaller gate appeared. Unlike North Gate, this one had not swollen completely shut. The iron ring moved. Barely. Daniel crouched beside her. "Let me." Mabel almost said no. Then she saw his face. Not angry now. Not embarrassed. Afraid, yes, but also present in a way he had not been around the marsh since he was a boy. Together, they pulled. The gate groaned. Mud bubbled. For one long second, nothing happened. Then water pushed through. It came in a narrow rush, clear and cold, sliding into the old channel with sudden purpose. Reeds bent. Ash lifted. The dark surface broke into silver lines as flow found a path it had not used in years. Daniel stared. Mabel sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Lottie covered her mouth. There was no crowd to see it. No county official, no developer losing his smile. No one from the diner who had laughed about ghost ditches. But for Mabel, it was enough. The marsh had answered. Daniel reached down and touched the moving water. When he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. Dad knew. Mabel nodded. Yes. Daniel looked toward the machine noise in the distance. If this whole system still works, and they cut through the wrong line, they could drain it wrong, Mabel said, or dry the wrong side, or send water where it can't help anybody. Daniel stood quickly. We need proof they can't ignore. We have water. They'll call it seepage. They'll call it old runoff. They'll say, you opened a rotten board and made up the rest. He was right. That hurt, but it was still right. They went back to the house before dark. With wet boots and one jar of clear water Daniel insisted on taking from the channel. He said he wanted it tested, though Mabel knew water in a jar could not prove a buried history. While Mabel helped Lottie warm her hands by the kitchen stove, Daniel went to the pantry shelf where Roy's map had been kept. He did not ask permission this time. He pulled down the old coffee tin, then the folded map, then the bundle of county notices Mabel had saved for reasons even she did not fully understand. Under those papers was a brittle envelope Mabel had never opened. It was addressed to Roy Hargrove, County Water Office, and stamped with a date 40 years old. Daniel slit it carefully with a butter knife. Inside was a single page, yellowed at the edges. At first, he read it standing. Then he sat down. Mabel noticed the change in him before she saw the paper. What is it? Daniel did not answer. She crossed the kitchen slowly and took the page from his hand. The heading read, Temporary Diversion Order South Ridge Fire Response. Below it were typed lines describing emergency water redirection from the South Marsh channels towards Central Miller's Crossing. Business District Priority, Pump Pressure Preservation, Fire Suppression Allocation. Mabel read the words twice because the first time her mind refused to hold them. Then, she saw the signature line. County Supervisor Harold Price. Fire Response Coordinator Ellis Boone. Ditch Writer Roy Hargrove. Roy's signature sat at the bottom in the same careful hand that had marked every gate on the map. For a moment, the kitchen disappeared. Mabel saw only his name. Daniel's voice was low. He signed it. Mabel gripped the paper. No. Mama. No, he wouldn't have. But he did. Lottie had not moved from the stove. Her face had gone old in a different way, as if the years had suddenly remembered where to sit. Mabel looked at her. Did you know? Lottie's eyes filled, but she did not look away. I knew there was an order, she said. I didn't know Roy's name was on it. Mabel's throat tightened. He told me he waited once. Lottie nodded slowly. They all waited. The men with radios, the men with keys, the men who thought they could send water north for 1 hour and bring it back south before the wind changed. Daniel stood, so Dad helped cut South Row off. The sentence struck the room harder than any shouting could have. Mabel wanted to defend Roy. She wanted to say he was only a ditch rider, only a man under orders, only one signature beneath men with more power. But the paper was in her hand, and Roy's name was still Roy's name. Lottie stepped closer. "Your father came back," she said to Daniel. "Before dawn, after the order failed, after the wind turned. He was in the ditch with his hands on the chain, screaming for men who had already run out of water. I saw him. He tried." Daniel's eyes were wet now, though he looked angry enough to hide it. "After." Lottie lowered her gaze. "Yes," she said. "After." Mabel sat down at the table. For 7 years, she had believed Roy's promise was a clean thing. Painful, yes. Heavy, yes. But clean. Now it had mud on it. Worse than mud. Guilt. Outside, the first emergency alert sounded from Daniel's phone. Then Mabel's. Then Lottie's. 3 thin alarms cutting through the kitchen at once. Daniel looked at the screen. His face changed. "Brush fire," he said. Mabel already knew before he finished. "Miller Ridge." Daniel swallowed. "North Slope. Moving east." The room went silent except for the phones. Mabel looked down at Roy's signature, then toward the dark window where the marsh lay beyond the yard. The promise had changed shape. It was no longer about protecting Roy's memory. It was about deciding what to do with the truth he had been too ashamed to fully leave behind. By late afternoon, smoke had turned the western sky the color of old pennies. At first, Miller's Crossing tried not to panic. People stood in driveways and watched the ridge as if watching from a distance could keep the fire there. Pickup trucks moved slowly along Main Street. At the gas station, men talked too loudly about wind direction and brush crews. At the grocery store, women bought water, batteries, and bread with the tight, embarrassed faces of people who did not want to look afraid. The official alert called it a brush fire. Mabel knew better. Brush fires did not make the light look that heavy. Daniel stood at her kitchen window, reading updates from his phone. Lottie sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched. The diversion order lay between them, Roy's signature visible at the bottom, like a wound no one could cover. "They're saying crews have it at 20%, Daniel said. "Who's saying?" Mabel asked. "County emergency page." Lottie gave a humorless sound. "Then it's 10. Daniel looked at her, but did not argue. A second alert came through 10 minutes later. Evacuation advisory for properties north of County Road 9. Smoke impact expected. Hydrant pressure monitoring in effect. Mabel reached for Roy's measuring stick. Daniel saw her. "No," he said. She did not answer. "No, Mama, not yet. We don't even know what the fire is going to do. We know where it started. That doesn't mean it's coming here." Mabel looked at him. Roy had once said, the worst mistake men made with fire was believing it had to ask permission to arrive. Before Daniel could say more, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. A gray county sedan stopped outside. Elaine Porter stepped onto the porch without waiting long after knocking. Her face was calm, but her hair had loosened at the temples, and there was ash on one sleeve of her blazer. "Mabel," she said, "we need to talk." Daniel opened the door wider. Elaine noticed Lottie at the table. Then she saw the paper. For 1 second, the calm left her face. "Where did you get that?" Mabel stood. "In Roy's things." Elaine entered slowly, closing the door behind her. "That document is 40 years old." "So was the mistake," Lottie said. Elaine looked at her, and something like recognition passed between them. Not friendly, not surprised either. "Mabel," Elaine said carefully, "this is not the time to stir up old pain. We have an active fire event. People need clear information, not rumors about obsolete water channels." "South Pond is not obsolete," Mabel said. Elaine's jaw tightened. "The modern hydrant system is handling suppression support." Daniel's phone buzzed again. He read the message and looked up. "North hydrant loop is dropping pressure." Elaine turned toward him sharply. "That is internal fire department information. It's on the scanner feed," Daniel said. Mabel picked up the measuring stick. Elaine stepped closer. "If you go out there and interfere with emergency response, you could be liable. If someone follows you into that marsh and gets hurt, it will not be treated as grief or confusion. Do you understand me?" Daniel moved between them. "She understands." "No," Mabel said softly. "Let her finish." Elaine lowered her voice. "Grant Voss has offered to withdraw his brush crew until after the fire is contained, if you agree not to enter the marsh or release unverified documents during the emergency." Lottie stared at her. "Unverified?" Elaine did not look at her. "There would also be a revised purchase offer," she continued. $120,000. Enough to settle the property, cancel the hearing, and allow you to move without further hardship. Daniel went still. Mabel felt it. The number entered the room like a third kind of fire. $120,000. A roof that did not leak. Prescriptions paid on time. No more choosing between the furnace and the electric bill. No more Daniel pretending not to leave envelopes of cash under the flour tin. No more waking in the night to wonder whether the house would outlive her. Grant Voss knew exactly where to press. "He sent you?" Mabel asked. Elaine's expression hardened. "I am trying to prevent chaos." "You are trying to prevent history." Elaine's eyes flashed. "You think history is simple because you found one paper. It is not. Men made decisions in that fire with minutes to spare. Some were wrong. Some may have saved lives elsewhere." "And the ones they didn't save?" Lottie asked. Elaine finally looked at her. The question landed. For a moment, she had no official answer ready. Daniel picked up the diversion order. His hands shook slightly. "Mama," he said, not looking at her. 120,000 would fix everything." "No," Mabel said. "It would fix the house." He looked up then. The hurt in his face was not greed. It was exhaustion. "You think that's small?" "No. Because I have watched you live like help was a sin. I have watched you patch that roof with coffee cans and tar paper. I have watched you keep Dad's promise while the house fell apart around you." Mabel's voice softened. "I know. Do you?" Daniel asked. "Because if you show this paper, you don't just hurt the county. You don't just hurt Elaine. You drag Dad's name through it too." Mabel looked down at Roy's signature. That was the cost no offer could count. Outside, a siren rose from town. Then another. Elaine's radio crackled at her hip. She turned away and listened, her face changing as the voice on the other end spoke too fast for the others to catch. "What happened?" Daniel asked. Elaine did not answer. Mabel did. "The hydrants." Elaine looked at her then, and this time there was fear in her eyes. "The North Loop is unstable," Elaine said. "Crews are requesting auxiliary water options." Lottie pushed herself up from the chair. "South Pond." Elaine shook her head. "No, we do not have time to test an undocumented system in an active fire." "You don't have time not to," Mabel said. Daniel stepped to the window. Beyond the trees, smoke was no longer a line over the ridge. It was a wall, dark at the bottom, copper at the top, moving in the wind. Then came a sound from the Marsh side, a deep mechanical clank. Daniel ran onto the porch first. Mabel followed. Across the low ground, near the survey flags, Grant's brush machine had started again. Its lights glowed through the smoke. The crew was cutting a wider access path, chewing through the reeds near the broken ditch line. Elaine cursed under her breath. Mabel turned to her. "You told him to stop." "I told him to pause." "That machine is cutting the wrong side." Daniel stared toward the marsh. "If it breaks the south channel, the pond drains away from town," Mabel said. Elaine's radio crackled again. A voice said something about nursing home evacuation, low pressure, and wind shift. Nobody spoke after that. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Mabel went back inside. She took Roy's map, the diversion order, and the measuring stick. Then she put the old brass valve key into Daniel's hand. He looked at it. "What are you doing?" What Roy should have done before the first fire got away from him. "Mama, if I fall, you show them both, the map and the order." Daniel swallowed. "And if they blame Dad?" Mabel's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "Then they will finally know him whole." She stepped off the porch toward the marsh. This time, Daniel followed. Smoke reached the marsh before the flames did. It came low across the ground, sliding through the reeds in gray sheets, making the orange survey flags appear and disappear like small fires of their own. The brush machine had stopped near the north edge, its engine ticking hot. One of Grant's men stood beside it with a phone to his ear, shouting that they had only been clearing access. Mabel did not look at him. She looked at the water. The broken ditch line was bleeding toward the wrong rut. If it kept running that way, South Pond would drain into a low pocket behind the road instead of feeding the channel Roy had marked. The marsh still had water, but water in the wrong place was only another kind of loss. Daniel stayed beside her, Roy's brass valve key in one hand and the diversion order folded inside his jacket. Lottie had refused to wait at the house. "I watched them lose South Row once," she said when Daniel tried to stop her. "I am not watching from a window this time." They met the first fire crew near the fence line. Chief Arlen Tate climbed down from his truck with ash on his helmet and impatience in every step. "Mrs. Hargrove, I don't have time for a property dispute." "Good," Mabel said, "because this is a water problem. Elaine arrived behind him, breathless from crossing the soft ground in dress shoes. Grant Voss followed, face tight, no longer smiling. "This area is unstable," Elaine said. "We cannot send crews into an undocumented marsh." Chief Tate pointed toward the smoke. "My hydrants north of Maine are dropping. I've got a nursing home on partial evacuation and wind pushing sparks downhill. If somebody has water, I'm listening." Mabel handed him Roy's map. "North Gate feeds Willow Cut. Willow Cut feeds South Pond. South Pond pushes through Split Channel. If we open them in order, you get a wet line between Miller Ridge and town." Grant stepped forward. "That is speculation." Daniel looked at him. "You knew the name Willow Cut before my mother ever said it to you." Grant's mouth closed. Mabel pointed with the measuring stick. "Shut that machine down and get it out of the channel." Chief Tate turned to his crew. "Do it." No one asked Grant's permission. For the first time since the survey flags appeared, men moved through the marsh because Mabel told them where to step. She led them to North Gate first. The smoke thickened as they worked. A young firefighter named Sophie dug with a flat shovel while Daniel cleared mud from the iron ring. Mabel stood over them, reading notches on the cedar stick, correcting their angle when they dug too far left. "Lower," she said. "There's a hinge under that root." Sophie looked up. "How do you know?" "Because Roy hated replacing hinges. He always built them where the cold mud held." The ring came free. Daniel fitted the brass key into the rusted slot. For one terrible second, it would not turn. Then, Chief Tate put both hands over Daniel's and pushed with him. Metal screamed. The gate shifted. A dark bubble rose, burst, and released a smell older than the fire. Then, water pushed forward. Not much at first, but steady enough to stir the ash from the surface. Mabel did not smile. "Willow Cut," she said. They moved south. At Willow Cut, the damage was worse. Grant's machine had chewed through roots that had been holding the ditch wall together. Water slipped sideways into the broken rut, wasting itself inch by inch. Mabel knelt, despite Daniel's warning, and pressed both hands into the mud, feeling for the old edge beneath the collapse. "Sandbags," she said. Chief Tate repeated the order, louder. Firefighters threw bags into the broken side while Daniel and Sophie pulled reeds across the gap. Lottie stood near the willow, cane sunk in mud, telling them where the old bank had been when she was a girl. "Not there," she called. "Left. The ditch bent left before the cottonwood." Elaine stared at her. "You remember that clearly?" Lottie's eyes stayed on the work. "When a place is taken from you, you remember where the door was." The words cut through the noise. Daniel heard them. So did Chief Tate. So did the young firefighter holding the sandbag. Elaine looked away first. When the temporary bank held, Mabel lowered the measuring stick again. The water climbed to the second long notch. "South Pond is ready," she said. At the hidden hollow, the smoke grew hot enough to sting their eyes. The fire was not visible yet, but the ridge beyond the trees glowed in flashes, orange behind gray. Ash fell into the black water like torn paper. South Pond waited under its skin of roots. Mabel guided Daniel to the smaller gate they had opened earlier. This time, they needed it wider. "Slow," she told him. "If you pull too hard, the old frame breaks." Daniel's face was streaked with soot and mud. "Dad teach you that?" Mabel looked at the water. "No," she said. "He left me enough to learn it the hard way." Together, they pulled. The gate groaned open. Water surged into the channel with a force that made Sophie step back. It ran clear beneath the ash, cold from the buried pond, filling the old cut that curved toward the ridge road. Chief Tate's radio crackled, pressure still dropping on North Loop, fire crossing lower brush line. He looked at Mabel. "One more," she said. "Split channel." Elaine stepped in front of her. "Mabel, before this goes any farther, that document." Daniel pulled the diversion order from his jacket. It already went farther. He had taken photos in the truck before they entered the marsh. Now, he sent them to Chief Tate, to the local reporter who ran the Miller's Crossing ledger page, and to every member of the emergency board whose number he had found on the county website. Elaine stared at him. "Daniel." He did not flinch. "You said people needed clear information." Chief Tate looked at his phone when the image came through. His expression changed as he read the heading. Temporary diversion order. South Ridge Fire response. Water redirection from South Marsh channels toward Central Business District. Then his eyes dropped to the signatures. He looked at Mabel. "Roy signed this?" Mabel's voice was quiet. "Yes." Grant Voss took a step back, as if the paper itself had heat. Lottie moved forward. "South Row had water before that order. she said. Maybe not much, but enough to fight. Afterward, we waited. We waited with buckets and wet quilts while the north side got pressure. Elaine's face had gone pale. My father was on the board then, she said. Yes, Lottie said. I know. No one spoke. The fire cracked somewhere beyond the trees, sharp as a rifle shot. Mabel lifted the measuring stick. Truth later, she said. Water now. They found Split Channel by following the current. It lay hidden under a mat of reeds so thick the firefighters had walked over it twice. Mabel drove the stick down, found wood, and pointed. There, Daniel and Sophie dug together. Chief Tate helped with his gloved hands. Even Elaine stepped into the mud at last, ruining both shoes without seeming to notice. When the last gate opened, the marsh changed sound. It was subtle at first, a low rush beneath the reeds, then a widening movement as old channels filled one after another, carrying South Pond water in a long curve between Miller Ridge and the back edge of town. The dead cattails trembled. Ash lifted. Mud darkened and shone. The wetline began to form. Fire crews moved with it, laying hose where the marsh gave them pressure and space. The water did not extinguish the wildfire. It was not a miracle. It did something more important. It slowed it. It bought minutes. Then more. Enough for the nursing home buses to clear the turn by the church. Enough for crews to wet the brush behind Main Street. Enough for the wind to shift against ground that was no longer dry. And while the marsh held, the full truth spread faster than the smoke. South Row had not been an empty patch of renters and shacks. It had been families, gardens, porches, children walking to the mill road, people who lost homes and were later told they had never officially belonged there. The diversion order had not only moved water, it had moved value. It had chosen which part of town mattered on paper and which part could be explained away afterward. Lottie lost her childhood home and never received compensation because her family was classified as temporary. 3 other families lost lease records when the county storage room later flooded. Roy carried the signature of that decision until it hollowed out his life. Mabel had spent 7 years protecting a promise without knowing it was built on guilt. Now everyone knew. Near the final gate, Mabel's hand slipped from the measuring stick. Daniel caught her before she hit the water, but her knees had already folded. Mama. She was not unconscious, not fully. Her eyes were open, fixed on the channel where cold water ran beneath the smoke. Did it hold? She whispered. Daniel looked toward the ridge. The fire line had slowed at the wet ground. Firefighters were moving, shouting, working with hope instead of panic. He took her muddy hand. Yes, he said. It held. Mabel closed her eyes. Behind them, the marsh kept running. And ahead of them, once the smoke cleared, Miller's Crossing would have to decide what kind of town it wanted to be, with the truth finally above water. By morning, the fire had not disappeared. It still smoked along the lower ridge. It still left black scars through pine and scrub oak. It still kept crews moving with shovels, hose lines, and tired eyes. But Miller's Crossing was standing. The nursing home was still there. Main Street was wet and streaked with ash, but not burned. The church windows were gray with smoke, but unbroken. The grocery store sign had melted along one edge, yet the building behind it remained. And beyond the back road, under a haze of steam and drifting ash, the marsh kept running. Nobody called it dead that morning. They came to look at it differently. Some stood at the fence line without speaking. Some pointed toward the old channels as if they had not driven past them for 30 years without seeing anything. A few men from the diner stood with their hands in their pockets, unable to meet Mabel's eyes when Daniel helped her out of Chief Tate's truck. She was wrapped in a fire blanket. Her boots were still black with marsh mud. Chief Tate did not make a speech. That was why people listened when he finally spoke. If that water line hadn't held, he said, looking at the crowd instead of the cameras, we would have been fighting structure fires on Main before midnight. Mrs. Hargrove gave us time. Sometimes time is the only thing between a town and a map full of ashes. Mabel looked down. She did not want applause. Some came anyway, scattered and uneasy, because the town did not yet know whether it was thanking her, apologizing to her, or trying to protect itself from what Daniel had released the night before. By noon, the diversion order was everywhere. The Miller's Crossing Ledger posted the image online with a short caption. Old South Marsh Water Order raises questions after wildfire response. Then, former South Row families began commenting. Names appeared under the post, like voices coming up through water. My grandmother lived there. Our lease papers disappeared. They told my father we had no claim. I thought South Row was just a story. Elaine Porter called an emergency meeting at the county building that afternoon. At first, she tried to control it. She stood behind the long table with smoke still in her hair and said the county would review archival inconsistencies and evaluate historical water management decisions. Lottie May, sitting beside Mabel in the front row, lifted her cane and struck it once against the floor. "No," she said. The room went quiet. Elaine blinked. "Mrs. May, say South Row." Elaine's mouth tightened. For a moment, the old Elaine returned. The official voice, the safe words, the polished distance. Then she looked at the back of the room, where families had gathered with printed photographs, old letters, and faces that did not want another careful sentence. Elaine lowered her papers. "South Row," she said. Lottie leaned back. It was not enough, but it was the first honest word the county had given them in 40 years. Elaine continued. "Slower now. The county will open all remaining fire response records from that year. We will suspend the condemnation hearing. We will request an independent review of the diversion order, the missing lease records, and the removal of South Row from later maps." A man in the back asked, "And if records are missing?" Elaine looked at him. "Then we will record testimony from those who remember." Her voice almost broke on the last word. Mabel watched her carefully. She did not mistake discomfort for redemption, but she knew the difference between a closed door and one beginning to move. Daniel said little during the meeting. His apology came the next morning. Mabel woke to hammering. At first, she thought it was the old roof giving up at last. Then she stepped onto the porch and saw Daniel on a ladder with 3 bundles of shingles, 2 borrowed sawhorses, and a tool belt he had not worn in years. He looked down when he heard the door. "I called Earl," he said. "He's bringing plywood." Mabel pulled her sweater around herself. "Daniel." He climbed down slowly. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he took off his work gloves and held them in one hand like a boy waiting to be corrected. "I thought Dad chose the Marsh over us," he said. "And maybe sometimes he did. Maybe he didn't know how to come home from what happened. But I was wrong about you." Mabel's eyes filled. Daniel looked toward the low ground beyond the road. "You weren't trying to disappear into that place," he said. "You were trying to keep the rest of us from disappearing from it." She touched his cheek with one muddy, weathered hand. "Your father was not perfect." "I know. So don't make him one now." Daniel nodded. "I won't." Later that day, Grant Voss tried one more time. He came without surveymen, without flags, without the bright confidence he had worn before the fire. He stood at the edge of Mabel's yard and offered what he called a compromise. Managed development, protected water access, a donation to a historical marker, and enough money to make sure Mabel never worried about bills again. Mabel listened until he finished. Then she said, "You still think this is mine to sell?" Grant frowned. "It is your parcel." "No," she said. "It is evidence. It is water. It is memory. And after last night, it is responsibility." At the next county meeting, Mabel made her terms plain. No sale. No warehouse. No quiet settlement. The marsh would be placed into a land trust, protected as emergency water infrastructure and historical ground. South Row descendants would hold seats on the trust board. The county would open its records and correct the maps. Fire crews would be trained on the old channels instead of pretending new systems made old knowledge useless. Elaine did not agree quickly, but she agreed. Grant walked out before the vote ended. Daniel stayed beside Mabel. Lottie cried, without covering her face. And when the motion passed, there was no roar of victory, only a long, uneven silence. The kind that comes when people understand that winning the truth is not the same as being finished with it. Outside, the marsh lay black and wet under the evening light. The survey flags were gone. In their place, Chief Tate had planted temporary wooden stakes marking Northgate, Willow Cut, South Pond, and Split Channel. Mabel stood beside them, exhausted but upright. For the first time, the town was not asking what the marsh was worth. It was asking who should learn how to keep it alive after her. 1 year later, the marsh was still there, not cleaned into something pretty, not drained into flat, useful land, not covered by gravel, loading docks, or a sign with Grant Voss's name on it. It was still muddy, still difficult, still full of mosquitoes in July and ice along the reeds in January. But now, along the old fence line, where the survey flags had once snapped in the wind, there stood a plain wooden board with 4 words burned into it. South Marsh Land Trust. Below it, in smaller letters, someone had added, water, memory, responsibility. Mabel had argued against anything grander. The town had talked about a monument at first, a bronze plaque, a formal dedication. Someone even suggested naming the marsh after her, which made Mabel frown so hard, Daniel laughed for the first time in weeks. It already had names, she said. You just forgot them. So the trust board chose simple markers instead. Northgate, Willow Cut, South Pond, Split Channel. And near the southern edge, where the old hollow lay beneath willow roots, they placed a smaller sign with the names of families from South Row. Not all of them. Some were still missing. Some had been scattered across counties and states. Some existed only in Lottie Mae's memory, in photographs with no last names written on the back, or in stories grandchildren had thought were family exaggerations. But the list was longer than the county first expected. That mattered. Every month, more people brought something. A lease receipt folded into a Bible, a photograph of 3 children standing beside a porch that no longer existed, a letter mentioning smoke on the ridge, a pay stub from the mill, a church program with the name South Row printed in faded ink. Elaine Porter kept her promise. Not perfectly, not easily. There were arguments, delayed files, missing boxes, and meetings where old language tried to crawl back into official minutes. But she showed up. She listened more than she spoke. And when the county published the corrected historical map, South Row appeared on it again. A small place. A real place. Lottie cried when she saw it. She touched the printed name with one finger and said, "There you are." Daniel did not talk much about Roy that year. He worked instead. He finished Mabel's roof before the first autumn rain. He replaced the porch steps. He cleared the ditch behind the house and patched the shed where Roy's tools still hung. He did not turn his father into a hero. He did not turn him into a villain either. That was harder. Some evenings, Mabel found him in the shed, holding the brass valve key or looking at the old coat with the sagging pocket. Once, she stood in the doorway and watched him wipe rust from the key with the edge of his shirt. "He should have told us," Daniel said. Mabel nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked at the key, but he did keep going back. "Yes," she said again. That was all they could say for a while. It was enough. By spring, Chief Tate had started training new firefighters on the Marsh system. He called it auxiliary water management. Mabel called it learning to listen before the fire starts. The youngest on the crew was Sophie, the firefighter who had helped dig out North Gate. She was 24, with quick hands, serious eyes, and a habit of asking questions without pretending she already knew the answers. Mabel liked that about her. On a cool morning in April, Sophie met her at the marsh with a notebook, rubber boots, and a county-issued map so clean it looked almost innocent. Mabel looked at the map and shook her head. "That will help you get lost." Sophie smiled. "That bad?" "That neat." They walked slowly along the channel. Daniel came with them, carrying a coil of rope and pretending he was only there in case his mother needed help. Lottie sat in a folding chair near the fence, wrapped in a blue sweater, watching South Pond through the willows. Mabel handed Sophie the measuring stick. Sophie took it carefully. The cedar had darkened over the years. Roy's notches were still there, worn but readable. Near the handle, the words "Ask Lottie" had softened under the oil of many hands. Daniel had cleaned the initials R, H, but had not carved anything new beside them. "Don't just put it in the water," Mabel said. Sophie paused. "Then what do I do?" "Look first." "At what?" Mabel pointed with her chin. "The reeds, the mud, the way the water sits. See there? That patch is too smooth, means it's moving underneath. And that line of cattails bends, because the channel turns before the map says it does." Sophie studied the marsh. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she moved 3 steps left and lowered the stick. It sank cleanly to the second notch. Mabel smiled. Not much, but Daniel saw it. Sophie looked up, surprised by the accuracy. "It's colder here." "Good," Mabel said. "Cold mud remembers water." The phrase moved through Daniel like an old door opening. Water goes where the ground remembers. He looked toward the ridge, then toward the marsh, then at the stick in Sophie's hands. For most of his life, he had thought the marsh had taken his father away. Maybe it had, maybe guilt had, maybe silence had. But now, watching someone young learn to read what Roy had failed to explain, Daniel understood something gentler. Not everything taken was wasted. Not everything broken stayed useless. Mabel reached for the stick, then stopped. Sophie tried to hand it back. Mabel shook her head. "You keep it for the morning." Sophie blinked. "I can't take this." "You're not taking it," Mabel said. "You're learning with it." Daniel looked at his mother. Mabel kept her eyes on the marsh. "For 7 years, I thought that stick belonged to Roy," she said. "Then I thought it belonged to me because I had kept his promise. But I was wrong both times." She nodded toward South Pond, where Lottie sat watching the water move through the reeds. "It belongs to whoever is willing to look down before the flames come over the ridge." Sophie held the stick differently after that, not like an artifact, like a tool. By noon, the sun had warmed the wet ground. Frogs started calling from the southern hollow. Wind moved through the cattails, and underneath that sound was another one, lower and steadier. Water running where no road could see it. Mabel stood beside Daniel at the edge of the channel. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at South Pond, at the new markers, at Lottie's blue sweater near the willow, at Sophie writing down what the marsh had taught her. "No," Mabel said softly, "but I'm closer." Daniel took her hand. They stayed there until the young firefighter raised Roy's stick again, read the notch correctly, and smiled at the water like she had heard it answer. The marsh had been called worthless once. Mabel never corrected that story with anger. She simply kept it alive, long enough for the truth to rise. And beneath the black mud, the water kept moving. Cold, clear, patient, waiting for anyone humble enough to listen.